I work as a receptionist at a hospital. A very strange woman walked in one night. If she asks you this one question, always answer no. Ah. What a pleasant way to begin my 3 a.m. shift at Mercy Hospital. The first thing I did as I sat down was cut my finger. It was a paper cut. And despite working at one of the largest hospitals in the state, I couldn't find a single band-aid laying around. I sucked on my index finger like a vampire while I scrambled my desk for that band-aid. I found one. Purple. I'm a hospital receptionist, and all that means is I greet visitors, make appointments, and look nice. Well, as nice as a 30-year-old man who hasn't slept in hours can look. That night, as we call it, it was just me and a few nurses on the floor. Other than that, it was ghost quiet. Except for the heavy, heavy rain. I sat back on the cheap recliner chair all receptionists get the honor of using. While adjusting my band-aid, I listened to the television mounted on the corner of the wall as it broadcasted a seemingly important message. Authorities say the woman was last seen on Cedar Avenue. I looked up to see if the television was showing any images of this strange woman. None. It was yet another crazy person with no name and no face who we were supposed to look out for. Not creepy at all. Authorities also say the woman was reportedly walking around and asking people very, very bizarre questions. I focused back on my desk and continued working, but still listened as the news anchor went on and on. She continued, The following statement was issued by an unidentified government official. Listen carefully, folks. Whatever she asks you, answer no. Do not, under any circumstances, answer yes. Officials won't comment further as to why, citing security clearance. Police are asking that you immediately call 911 if you deem anyone suspicious. I thought that part of the coverage was quite odd, but I wasn't sure anything could scare me anymore. Working here at the hospital, I thought I had seen it all. At the flash of the ruby red ambulance lights, I've seen people come in with severed arms, legs, and fingers, people who somehow managed to scoop out their eyes, failed suicide attempts, and much, much more. You get used to it. My head was practically sunk into my desk as I filled out paperwork. That's when I heard something very subtle initially. I heard it coming from the front doors, the entrance. The automatic doors opened and closed, slamming against each other and sounding an obnoxiously loud thud each time. The very dim lighting I had surrounding my desk flickered incessantly. Hello, I called out, seated behind the safety of my desk. Only the whistling wind responded. Hello, I called out again. I felt obligated to check if someone was there, especially since it might have been someone who was injured and needed our attention. I reluctantly picked myself up from my chair and walked over to inspect. I nearly slipped and cracked my head open as the entrance floor was almost flooded from the rain. I noticed footsteps and wet shoe marks that seemed to come inside the hospital and then back out. I stood near the doors, poking my head outside, and looked. All I heard were the distant sounds of sirens and honking cars. The rain poured harder. The peace and quiet were disturbed within moments of me sitting back down. The automatic doors started again, opening and closing, slamming shut, and letting in more rain as they did. But this time, I heard gentle footsteps make their way towards me, tapping closer and closer. Someone slowly emerged from the darkness between the entrance and the front desk. A woman with drenched black hair approached, wearing a dark brown raincoat and a pair of boots that were too large for her toothpick legs. Her face was inundated with wrinkles and wet makeup, her black eyeshadow smudged. Despite the heavy rain outside, she didn't seem to have bothered wearing her hoodie. Hello. How can I help you, ma'am? She didn't respond. She looked around, scanning and observing an unimpressive hospital. Is there something I can help you with? Still nothing. We engaged in a brief stare down, which she won. I looked down and pretended to gather important paperwork. Are you here to visit someone? Then finally she responded, without talking. She simply nodded and then took a few steps forward, her hands hanging down her side. Her posture was unnatural, almost uncomfortable. Okay, for now I need you to sign here. Then you'll have to wait a few hours for visiting time to begin, I said, pushing forward a sheet of paper and pen. She raised her arm to sign and then abruptly stopped. She seemed startled by something on the desk. She looked at me, tilted her head, and, with a smile that was as wide as her eyes, said, "Would you please move that for me?" I was confused at first, and then she pointed at it with her index finger, as drops of rainwater tapped against my desk while her arm hovered over it. I took the little crucifix we had on the front desk and put it in a drawer. The woman proceeded as if she was going to finally sign the paper, and then stopped before writing anything. She dropped the pen on the ground and stood there again, staring at me. She asked me a question. "Do you reject the Trinity?" "I'm sorry," I replied. For a few more uncomfortable moments, the woman stood there like an ancient statue. I had no idea what she meant by the question. "Ma, I am. Who exactly are you here to see? Family, friend? What's your relationship with the patient?" Before I could finish talking, midway through my question, the woman turned around and walked out the door, still smiling, and her eyes as wide as I'd ever seen on a person. I went back to work and tried to move on, but her creepy mannerisms were trapped in my mind throughout the night. At around 4 a.m., I spotted one of the children in our hospital walking down the hallway. "Nina? Is that you?" I called out. All the kids in the hospital knew me. I was proudly considered one of the cooler employees. I let them break the rules, brought them snacks upstairs, and even told them scary stories, despite their predictable regret later on. The nurses would get angry with me every time I held one of my scary story nights. They always had a bunch of bed sheets to change the next morning. I only did these things for the kids when I wasn't busy, when it was a quiet night. And this was one of those uneventful nights, which of course was a good thing. Anyway, it was very odd to see Nina awake at that time, walking down those shadowy halls. She was absolutely terrified of the dark, and yet there she was. "Nina, is that you?" I squinted my eyes as I walked towards her. "Sorry, Matt," she began. "I don't want to be there anymore." She had dragged her blue blanket along with her, which was her way of gesturing to the staff that she wanted to move to another room. "The other kids bothering you again?" I asked. I took hold of her hand and began walking her back to the elevator. "Matt, please don't make me go back up there. I don't like the new nurse." I stopped walking. "What?" I said, kneeling to Nina's level. "She keeps asking us the same question over and over." I said no so many times. I kept telling her no, but everyone else kept laughing with her and saying yes to her. "Please, I don't want to go back up there." Nina's words immediately played flashbacks inside my tired, overworked mind. Something about a strange woman going around and asking even stranger questions. I didn't pay enough attention to that broadcast to notice the woman, but even if I had, I thought she had left the hospital. I ditched the elevator and ran up a flight of daunting stairs, stomping against each step with all the force I could muster. I probably woke up all those sleeping employees, I was so loud. I opened the door to the children's room and couldn't believe my eyes. I checked each room, each one on each floor. I woke up my coworker and asked about the children. She couldn't find them either. We looked everywhere and put the hospital on lockdown. We set off all possible alarms and other emergency procedures. We didn't find them. They just disappeared. I bought a creepy painting in an online auction. There's something horribly wrong with it. I've always loved creepy shit. It started off with horror books, reading Goosebumps in elementary school, later graduating onto Stephen King, Shirley Jackson, Mark Z. Danielewski, and a myriad of others. Eventually, I started writing my own scary stuff, mostly because I wanted to create stories that I would want to read for myself as a horror fan. After about a decade, I got to be marginally successful, and nowadays it's how I pay the bills. I never thought my life would turn into a horror story, though. How ironic is that? Some people decorate their houses with colorful vases stuffed with flowers, Norman Rockwell paintings, knickknacks, and crystal sculptures of dolphins and fairy princesses. I prefer to cover my walls with freaky drawings, paintings, and prints of artworks by Francisco Goya, Anthony Christopher, and Salvador Dali. The weirder and darker the better. I like my art the same as I like my novels horrifying and unsettling. So when my friend Marcus sent me a text with the title "Check out this painting of a creepy old lady," I laughed and clicked on the link without too much thought. I was redirected to an obscure foreign website where old and new paintings were being sold in a never-ending online auction. I hadn't heard of the auction company before, but that didn't stop me from pulling out my credit card as soon as I saw the image that had been shared with me. A woman's hypnotic and bizarre face stared back at me, looking lifelike and yet utterly surrealistic. Not to mention terrifying. Her pupils were too big and too black. Her smile stretched too wide, like a Dr. Seuss character, but devoid of any kindness or good humor. It was a portrait of an elderly woman who appeared to be in her 70s or 80s. She was dressed in dark, monastic-looking clothing, which I guessed to be a couple hundred years old. I figured it was a reproduction of an older painting since the price tag was only $50, the style similar to a Renaissance painting, the brush strokes well hidden, her face photographically realistic, as if painted by an old-world master. The woman in the painting was sitting on an antique wooden chair with embellishments carved into the posts of the backrest. Her eyes seemed to follow me and look back at me maliciously. The impression I got was that she was a real person staring back at me from the portrait, like glancing through a window and seeing the face of an unknown stranger standing just outside. I felt as if she could reach through the screen and grab hold of me if she wanted to. Without hesitating, I put in my credit card details before somebody else could buy it. The thing was just too weird to pass up. After a week or so of waiting, the parcel arrived on my doorstep. I had semi-forgotten about it by that point since I had been busy with other things. But as soon as I saw its distinctive flat, rectangular shape wrapped in brown parcel paper, I remembered my impulse purchase and brought it inside with giddy delight, happy to unwrap it right away. As soon as I had it open, my heart dropped and I felt sick, like I could throw up. I had rarely felt buyer's remorse, but I definitely did when I looked down at the woman's face staring back at mine. She looked alive, and she looked undeniably evil. I couldn't explain why I felt that way, but I did. The idea of hanging the thing on my wall repulsed me. Just touching it felt like picking up a handful of maggots. It made my skin crawl. After putting it down, I wanted nothing more than to get rid of it. But it felt wrong to just throw it in the garbage. I've never been that type of person, especially with art. It didn't matter how creepy it was. Someone had put a lot of time and effort into it. Yet, it was far too disturbing to hang up on a wall in the living room where I would see it all the time. More than just disturbing, I seemed to be having a physical reaction to it like I had never felt before. A growing knot in my stomach, and a rising sensation in my gorge. I went into the kitchen and took the oven mitts from on top of the fridge, picked the portrait up with them, and held it out in front of me as if it were radioactive. I brought it down to the basement of my house and set the giant frame down against a wall on the floor, thinking I would leave it there for a while, until I got used to it, telling myself, out of sight, out of mind. There was no way to get it out of my thoughts, though. I kept seeing the woman's face every time I blinked, her glassy black eyes and too wide grin. I couldn't sleep that night, thinking about her down below me in the basement. I felt like I could almost hear her moving around down there. The gentle creak of her footsteps stepped quietly across the floorboards. But that was impossible, I told myself. Those things were impossible. Still, I didn't sleep. Not even for a second. The following night, I went down to the basement to do laundry, after building up the courage all day to go down there, and I walked past the painting. The woman's stern black eyes seemed to follow me as I went by. Her entire body was cloaked in shadow, the gloomy details of her face barely visible in the portrait's low light. It was late at night, and I lived alone, so I was more than a bit freaked out when I heard something loudly topple over when I turned my back to her, causing a shiver to run up my spine. I dropped the laundry basket and spun around to look. She was staring at me from her place in the portrait. She had not moved, and yet her eyes seemed to be following me, the faintest movement barely noticeable with the naked eye. There was something else, too. A box had toppled over, spilling its contents on the chair beside the painting, and yet I had not stepped anywhere near enough to disturb it. The woman's smile seemed to have grown wider as well, crooked teeth starting to peek out from underneath her broken, bloody lips had those looked like that before. But maybe that was just my imagination. I decided not to look closer. I imagined her suddenly climbing out of the painting as I leaned in to inspect it, crawling out of the frame like the girl in the ring, and racing towards me quickly on all fours. Shaking that image from my mind, I picked up the bin again and reluctantly turned away. I quickly put the laundry in the washing machine and turned it on, then walked past her again on my way back upstairs. There was no mistaking it. Her grin had stretched wider, and beneath that, I saw a long row of teeth, dirty, crooked, utterly inhuman. I was very sure it hadn't looked like that before. Was I seeing things due to my lack of sleep? I wiped my eyes and blinked, examining the painting again. No teeth. And yet I had been so sure a second earlier. Unable to stand looking at it for one more moment, I decided to do something. My heart was beating rapidly in my chest and my hand was shaking as I reached down and flipped the painting around so that it faced the wall. Her smile seemed to shrink a little bit, her eyes following my hand, brows furrowing, as she looked up at me, reaching over her to grab the top of the picture frame. My skin crawled again when I touched it. I fought through the urge to retch and spun it around quickly, as if it would burn me if I held on for too long. When she was facing the wall, I felt no better, only more uneasy, as if I had turned my back on a deadly enemy. Again that night, I heard someone in the basement moving around, walking from room to room. I was just glad she didn't come up the stairs, but I had a feeling she would. And soon. That whole night I stayed awake, listening for the footsteps. Every so often I would hear them, and every so often there would be a titter of muffled laughter, bemused and unsettling. The next morning I called a friend over. I needed someone else to look at it, to make me feel less alone, I suppose. I was hoping the presence of another person would make things better somehow. But I was wrong. My friend Brent came by and I brought him down to the basement immediately. He took one look at the painting, which was now mysteriously tipped over, facing upwards, then walked straight out of the room, saying nope. He went back up the stairs and out the front door of the house, much to my amazement. I followed him and stood with him on the front steps. Brent was out there with his hands on his knees, bent over and looking oddly out of breath. But then I realized he wasn't just short of breath, he was completely terrified. "Where the hell did you get that thing?" he asked, his speech fast and stuttering. Why, you can't keep it. You can't. It's evil. Possessed. It looked right at me. How can you sleep with that thing in your house?" Brent hadn't stuttered since back in elementary school, except for the odd time when he was really stressed out. He'd seen speech-language experts for years and had eventually cured himself of the speech disorder. It only came out when he was really upset. I haven't slept a wink since I got that thing. He looked me dead in the eyes. "Get rid of it." I told him I would, with every intention of throwing it in the trash or burning it after he left, but for some strange reason I could not. I decided I had to do something with it first. I had to find out some answers. The next day, after another restless night of tossing and turning, I brought the painting out to my car. We were going to go for a little drive together. I had wrapped it up in a blanket, and the portrait was covered up so nobody could see it, mostly because I didn't want to look at it, especially while I was driving. There was an art expert about 2 hours drive away from my house. I had looked him up online and found he was a well-established authority on all things creepy and disturbing. It had taken a while to find someone with his reputation, the better part of the previous day, in fact. While I drove, I looked back at the painting in the rearview mirror occasionally. From underneath the blankets, I could have sworn I saw subtle movement. The bend and ripple of the sheet kept catching my eye and distracting me from the road ahead. It could have been the wind, but it wasn't. I was certain of it. "You've got yourself quite an antique, by the looks of it," the man said, beginning to pull back the blanket to reveal the gilded frame. I realized I was holding my breath, closing my eyes and waiting for his reaction when he saw the horrifying woman in the portrait. But when he finally gasped in astonishment, I realized it was not a fearful sound, but one of admiration."Remarkable." Opening my eyes, I looked at what he was seeing. The The face of the woman in the portrait was not the same. I did a double take and wondered for a moment if he had switched them out when I wasn't paying attention. But no, it was the same frame, the same woman in the portrait. Only her expression had changed remarkably. Instead of the horrifying smile, she now wore a benign look on her face, a passive, good-natured smirk that I was unaccustomed to seeing on her. Magnificent chiaroscuro. That's a technique that involves heavy-handed use of shadows and darkness with little light, in case you aren't familiar. But the brushstrokes, my goodness. Utterly invisible, he said, holding up a loop to examine it closely. It looks as if she's alive. Someone went to a lot of trouble to make this. Do you have the provenance? The proof of what I should have known the word did, in fact, but was far too tired to remember what it meant at that moment. I'd now gone nearly 4 full days without sleep and was dead on my feet. Any idea of its origins or its age? No. Sorry. I got it online at this site, I said, pulling out my phone and trying to show him. But the website no longer existed as far as I could tell. Weird. I guess it's down right now. I'll send you the URL. He thought about it for a few minutes, going over the painting with various tools and magnifying lenses. Ah, here's something, he said excitedly. What's that, I asked. Damn, I can only see part of the signature. I'll have to take it out of the frame. Can you leave it with me until tomorrow? I agreed, unsure of how to explain to him the situation other than to say, be careful with it. In retrospect, I guess I should have. I should have at least tried. Poor bastard. The art expert didn't pick up the phone the following day, and I thought maybe he just needed more time with the piece. But inside I knew something was very wrong already. I had slept for the first time in 4 nights, though no longer hearing the footsteps creaking on the floorboards beneath me anymore. And I wanted one more night of peace before hearing the truth from the man I'd left the picture with. Selfish, I know. In retrospect, I was just terrified to go back there. Who knew what I would find? After one more night of rest, I called the art expert again, and once more I received no answer, no call back. Getting worried for the old guy now, I got in my car and started driving. First thing in the morning. I didn't eat breakfast, feeling like I would throw it up if I did. Despite the lack of food in my belly, it felt like there was a cinder block sitting inside of it the whole drive there. I just hoped he was okay. When I arrived at the man's studio, I found the front door was unlocked. I entered the small foyer and found it dark and empty inside. He did not come out to greet me this time, and the sense of dread I was feeling continued to grow and swell inside of me. With slow, careful steps, I began to walk through the foyer toward the door where his studio was kept. That was where I had last left him, and I hoped that I would open the door to find him standing there, working on something. I no longer cared about the painting. In fact, I hoped that he had destroyed it in my absence. That way I wouldn't have to do it. The last 2 nights had given me a clearer mind, and the sleep had afforded me perspective and insight into the situation. The thing had to be destroyed, but it had some power over me, which had prevented me from doing so. I had been tricked into hanging onto it and showing it to more and more people. Pushing open the door marked studio, I went inside the next dark room. Hello, I called out in the blackened space. A soft gurgling noise responded. It sounded bubbly and wet. I reached over to turn on the light but found it no longer worked. The room stayed drenched in darkness, and then I heard that same familiar titter of laughter I'd heard from my basement. My heart now pounding in my chest, I swallowed a dry lump in my throat. Reaching for my phone, I pulled it out and tried with trembling fingers to turn on the flashlight app. My hands were shaking so badly I dropped the phone. I bent down to pick it up and heard movement in the darkness. It was getting closer. There was another sound as well, a soft drip, 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 like a leaky roof, only coming from several different places. Picking up the phone from the floor, I managed to unlock it as I felt a presence move past me in the darkness. The air around me suddenly felt cold as a winter's night, and I found myself shivering and shaking even more as I finally got the flashlight turned on. The light came on, casting the room in its harsh white glow. Chiaroscuro. A grotesque sort of art exhibit had been created in the studio, but not by the resident art expert who I had met 2 days prior. No, he had not made this monstrosity, but he was certainly a part of it. The whole room was filled with his entrails, strung up and down and across the perimeter like party streamers. He was at the center of it all. His body had been disemboweled and his guts had been pulled out and wrapped around the room. His limbs had been removed as well, but were nowhere to be seen. That was when I saw the most horrifying part. He was still somehow alive, his mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, his skin partially missing from his face, revealing stark white bone beneath, ligaments and tendons. HMMOOH came from his mouth and I noticed his tongue had been removed as well, and blood was pouring out, causing him to cough and choke occasionally. The walls had been painted with his blood, which was everywhere. Various symbols that I did not recognize were on every inch of the room, ceilings, floors, and walls. They looked druidic and ancient, their meanings unknown to me. As I looked around, I remembered the noise I had heard by the door. I spun and saw her standing there in the darkness. The woman from the painting. She was dressed in a dark robe and her grin was wider than ever. Large and open with silent laughter. Blood was smeared around her mouth. In her hand she held the painting itself, only she was no longer in it. The background was black and empty, now missing its subject. Realizing suddenly what was happening, I noticed that her entrancing eyes were coming towards me. She was coming towards me. How long had I been standing there, zoned out? The only thing that had snapped me out of it was the gurgling screams of the art expert, sounding desperate and terrified. She held the picture frame out in front of her, as if to capture me in it. My heart beat fast. I did the only thing I could think to do. I shone the flashlight straight into her eyes, hoping it would be her weakness. A creature born of the shadows and of the darkness, I thought maybe the light would do something to stop her. It worked. The second the glare hit her eyes, she put her hands up to shield her face, covering it with the picture frame. But her hands continued to burn and sizzle like a vampire in the sun. Still, she continued moving toward me. Terrified, I backed up, tripping over a chair and falling to the floor. The phone fell from my hand and clattered away in the direction of the art expert. His face was lit up, looking at me in its harsh glow. "Vaswitch," he yelled, struggling to speak without a tongue, looking close to death from blood loss. He was looking at the wall, and I could see a light switch there. Struggling to my feet, I saw she was nearly on top of me and heard her quietly whispering some sort of prayer or chant under her breath. I ducked away just as she brought down the portrait where my head was a moment before. I had the feeling if I hadn't gotten out of the way, I would be stuck inside that painting now, just like she had been. In the dull light, I managed to find the light switch on the nearby wall with my hand and flicked it on, casting the entire room in harsh white artificial light. The woman from the painting screamed, her skin boiling and steaming in the glow of the fluorescence. Boils and blisters bloomed and burst on her skin, pus and blood running out in rivulets. Covering her face with her robes, she ran to the door and fled, just as she was about to catch fire, judging by the looks of it. I hoped she would leave, but she didn't. Her footsteps stopped just outside the door. She's still out there in the foyer, waiting for me in the darkness, waiting for the sun to go down, waiting for me to try and leave. I can hear her pacing as she waits for me to come out the next subject for her painting. The art expert is dead now. He stopped breathing a few minutes ago. It's just me left with his bloody guts strewn around the room and strung up like a giant intestinal spider web all around me. The drip, drip, drip begins to slow down as his blood coagulates. The blood-painted symbols on the walls begin to move and shift and morph as the one working fluorescent bulb in the room flickers and suddenly goes out. I really wish I'd just burned that damn painting.